At the Father's Day dinner, my daughter raised her glass. "To the old man who isn't half the man my husband is." Everyone at the table laughed. I looked at my daughter and replied, "Then, from today on, he's the one paying your rent." She turned pale and whispered, "Dad, what rent?" Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I should have known something was wrong the moment Zoe walked through my front door that Father's Day evening. There was something different in her posture, a smugness I hadn't seen before, like she was carrying a secret she couldn't wait to share. But I was so focused on making everything perfect. The roast beef she loved as a child, the wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, the carefully set table with my late wife's good china, that I missed all the warning signs. At 59, I'd learned to treasure these moments with my 28-year-old daughter. Since Margaret passed 5 years ago, family dinners had become sacred to me. Zoe was all I had left, and despite the growing distance I'd felt between us lately, I held on to hope that tonight would bring us closer together. Richard arrived with her, of course. My son-in-law had this way of filling a room that made me feel smaller somehow. He was one of those men who commanded attention without saying much. Tall, perfectly groomed, with an expensive watch that caught the light just right. Everything about him screamed success, from his tailored shirts to the way he spoke about his work in finance like he was doing the world a favor. "David," he said, gripping my hand just a little too firmly, "great to see you. House looks good." I wanted to feel proud of his approval, but something in his tone made it sound like he was surprised I could manage to keep my own home in order. I pushed the feeling aside and focused on being a good host. Dinner conversation started normally enough. Zoe told me about her new yoga instructor. Richard mentioned some deal he was working on. I shared updates about my job at the hardware store, though I noticed their eyes glaze over whenever I spoke. It was nothing new. I'd grown used to feeling like my life wasn't quite interesting enough for them. But then came the toast. I'd prepared a small speech, something heartfelt about family and gratitude, but Zoe stood up first. She grabbed her wine glass with a flourish that should have been my second warning sign, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. My daughter wanted to honor me on Father's Day. For a moment, I felt like the luckiest man alive. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her voice carrying that theatrical quality she'd had since she was little. Richard was smiling beside her, and I noticed he had his phone out, probably recording the moment. "To my father," she began, and I straightened in my chair, ready to receive whatever loving words she'd prepared. "To the old man who isn't half the man my husband is." The words hit me like cold water. I blinked, certain I'd misheard, but the way Richard chuckled and the satisfied smile on Zoe's face told me I hadn't. She continued, oblivious to the shock spreading across my features. "Richard has shown me what a real provider looks like, what it means to be taken care of by someone who actually has his life together. Dad, you tried your best, but let's be honest, Richard is everything you never were." The room went silent except for the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I'd never noticed before. There was cruelty in her eyes, a casual dismissal that made me feel like I was nothing more than a disappointing footnote in her success story. Richard raised his glass with a modest smile, as if accepting praise that was his due. "Well, I do try to take good care of my wife," he said, his voice dripping with false humility. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the years of feeling inadequate. Maybe it was the way they looked at me like I was some kind of charity case, or maybe it was just the simple injustice of being humiliated in my own home on Father's Day. Whatever it was, I found my voice. "That's interesting, Zoe," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Since Richard is such an amazing provider, I guess that means he won't mind taking over your rent payments starting tomorrow." The color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might faint. "What rent payments?" The confusion in her voice was genuine. She honestly had no idea. For 3 years, I'd been quietly transferring $800 every month to her landlord, telling myself it was temporary help while she got on her feet. She'd graduated college with a degree in art history and bounced between part-time jobs that barely covered her expenses. I'd watched her struggle and stepped in, because that's what fathers do. We protect our children from hardship, but she thought Richard was paying for everything. Your apartment, sweetheart, the one on Maple Street with the exposed brick you love so much? I've been covering the rent since you moved in. Richard's cocky smile faltered. Zoe's wine glass trembled in her hand. That's impossible, she whispered. Richard pays for everything. He takes care of me. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, showing her the monthly transfers. $800 every month for 36 months. $28,800 I'd given to ensure my daughter had a roof over her head while she figured out her life. I wanted you to feel independent, I said quietly. I thought if you knew I was helping, you'd feel like a failure. So I let you believe whatever story made you happy. Zoe sank back into her chair, staring at the phone screen like it was written in a foreign language. Richard was no longer recording. In fact, he'd gone very quiet, his jaw tight with what looked like anger. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 3 years of lies. Not lies I'd told, but lies she'd told herself. Lies about who was taking care of whom, about who had value and who didn't. Finally, Zoe looked up at me, her eyes wide with something between shock and humiliation. Dad, I didn't know. I thought, you thought what? That your old man was such a loser he couldn't even help his own daughter? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. You thought Richard was so much better than me that he could afford to support a wife who doesn't work full-time? Richard cleared his throat. Now hold on, David. There's no need to get hostile. Hostile? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. My daughter just told me I'm half the man you are, and you want to talk about hostile? The evening I'd planned so carefully was crumbling around me, but for the first time in years, I felt something other than the constant ache of not being good enough. I felt angry, and that anger was clarifying in ways I hadn't expected. As I looked at my daughter's pale face and my son-in-law's uncomfortable silence, I realized this moment was about to change everything between us. The question was whether it would destroy us completely or finally force us to deal with the truth we'd all been avoiding. The truth about who was really taking care of whom in this family. The days following that disastrous Father's Day dinner passed in a haze of regret and revelation. I kept replaying the moment over and over, wondering if I should have handled it differently, if I should have kept my mouth shut and preserved the illusion that had been keeping our family together. But every time I considered calling Zoe to apologize, I remembered the look in her eyes when she called me half a man, and the anger would return. 3 days later, she finally called. Dad, we need to talk. Her voice was small, nothing like the confident woman who had humiliated me in my own dining room. I'm listening. Can I come over, please? An hour later, she was sitting on my couch, looking younger than her 28 years. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she kept twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, not meeting my eyes. About the rent. What about it? I don't understand why you didn't tell me. All this time, I thought Richard and I were doing so well. I thought we were successful. The pain in her voice almost broke my resolve, but I needed her to understand. Zoe, do you remember when you first moved into that apartment? She nodded. You called me crying because you couldn't make the deposit. You'd used all your savings on furniture and didn't have enough left over. You were so ashamed, you begged me not to tell Richard. Her face crumpled, I remember. So I called your landlord and worked out an arrangement. I told you I'd lent you the money, but really, I just started paying your rent directly. I thought it would be temporary, just until you got on your feet. But why didn't you stop? Why didn't you tell me when Richard and I got married? This was the part I'd been dreading. Because you seemed so happy believing you were independent, and because I paused, choosing my words carefully. Because Richard seemed to want you to believe he was providing for you. Her head snapped up. What do you mean? I got up and walked to my home office, returning with a folder I'd been keeping for the past 3 years. Financial records, copies of rent payments, and something else. Emails between Richard and myself that I'd never shown her. 6 months after you moved in, Richard contacted me. He said he knew I was helping with your expenses and that he appreciated it, but he wanted to take over. He said it would be better for your relationship if you believed he was the provider. Zoe's face went white as I handed her the printed emails. But here's the thing, sweetheart. He never took over. He just let you believe he had. Every month he'd tell you he was handling the bills, and every month I kept paying them. She read through the emails with shaking hands. There it was, in black and white, Richard thanking me for my discretion and promising to gradually take over the financial responsibilities. Emails that stretched back over 2 years, with Richard always finding reasons why it wasn't the right time for him to start paying, always assuring me that it would be just a few more months. He knew, she whispered. He knew everything. The rent, the car insurance I helped with when you had that accident, the credit card I paid off last Christmas when you thought he'd surprised you by clearing your debt. Zoe buried her face in her hands. Oh God, how much, Dad? How much have you been paying? I didn't want to tell her, but she deserved the truth. Beyond the rent, probably around $45,000 over the past 3 years. The number hung in the air between us like a physical weight. $45,000 that I'd scraped together by working overtime at the hardware store, by skipping vacations, by driving my old truck long past when I should have replaced it. Money I'd given gladly, because I thought I was helping my daughter build a life. I work at a hardware store, I continued, my voice growing harder. I make $38,000 a year. Do you know what it means for me to give you that much money? She was crying now, quiet sobs that shook her shoulders. I didn't know, Daddy. I swear I didn't know. But you were happy to believe Richard was so much more successful than your old man, weren't you? It felt good to think you'd married up, that you'd found someone who could give you everything I never could. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you asked about my life? When's the last time you seemed interested in anything I was doing? You used to call me every week, Zoe. Now I'm lucky if I hear from you once a month. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Richard said you were getting clingy. He said it wasn't healthy for me to depend on you so much, that I needed to focus on our marriage. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. So he isolated you from me while taking credit for money I was sending. I don't think he meant it that way. Didn't he? Zoe, he's been playing both sides. He gets to be the successful husband in your eyes while I foot the bills, and I get to be the pathetic father who can't even provide for his own daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my daughter process the reality of her situation, saw the moment when the full weight of it hit her. She wasn't the independent young woman she thought she was. Her marriage wasn't the financial success story she'd believed, and the man she'd just praised for being twice the man I was had been living a lie for years. What am I going to do? She asked finally. That's up to you. But Zoe, I meant what I said at dinner. I'm done paying for your life while you treat me like I'm nothing. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, real fear. Not fear of me, but fear of a future she suddenly realized she couldn't afford. Can we work something out, just until I figure things out? I shook my head. Not this time. You're 28 years old. You're married to a man who supposedly has his life together. Figure it out. As she left that afternoon, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the relationship we'd lost, for the years of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But relief, too, because I was finally done carrying the weight of everyone else's illusions. I had no idea that the real revelations were still to come, or that Richard's manipulations ran far deeper than either of us imagined. 2 weeks after my conversation with Zoe, I was starting to think maybe I'd been too harsh. The silence from her end was deafening, and despite everything, she was still my daughter. I was considering reaching out when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Hartwell? This is Janet Morrison from East Side Property Management. It took me a moment to place the name. She was Zoe's landlord. My stomach dropped. I'm calling because we haven't received this month's rent payment, and I wanted to check if there was an issue with the automatic transfer. Actually, Janet, I won't be making any more payments. My daughter and her husband will need to handle their rent directly from now on. There was a pause. Oh, well, that's going to be a problem. They're already 2 weeks late, and when I contacted Mrs. Mrs. Davidson, she seemed confused about the payment arrangements. Confused how? She said her husband handles all the finances and that she'd have to talk to him. But Mr. Davidson hasn't returned any of my calls. I thanked Janet and hung up, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I decided to drive by Zoe's apartment, telling myself I just wanted to make sure she was okay. The building looked the same as always, but Zoe's car wasn't in her usual spot. I was about to leave when I saw her walking up the sidewalk, carrying grocery bags and looking exhausted in a way I hadn't seen since her college days. "Dad?" She spotted me before I could decide whether to approach. "What are you doing here?" "Your landlord called me. She said you haven't paid rent." Zoe's face crumpled. "I know. Richard says he's handling it, but..." She gestured helplessly. "I don't understand what's happening." "Where is Richard?" "He's been working late a lot, this big deal he's been talking about. He says once it goes through, everything will be fine." I'd heard enough. "Zoe, we need to talk, and I think Richard needs to be part of this conversation." That evening, I found myself back in their apartment for the first time since they'd moved in. It was nicer than I'd expected, too nice for what Richard claimed to earn. The furniture was expensive, the electronics top of the line. As I looked around, I realized I was seeing exactly where my money had gone. Richard arrived home an hour later, his confident demeanor faltering the moment he saw me sitting at his kitchen table. "David, I wasn't expecting you." "I bet you weren't." "Sit down, Richard. We need to talk." Zoe looked between us nervously. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is." "Harder than what?" "Zoe, do you know what your husband's been doing?" Richard loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, expensive whiskey that probably cost more than I made in a week. "I don't know what you're implying, but..." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "For 3 years, I've been sending $800 a month for rent." "But that's not all, is it, Richard?" His face had gone pale, but he said nothing. "The furniture in this apartment? I have receipts showing you used my credit card information to make purchases totaling over $12,000. You told me it was for Zoe's birthday and Christmas presents." Zoe gasped. "Richard, is that true?" "And the car payments," I continued. "The insurance?" "The vacation to Mexico last year that you posted all over social media, talking about how you'd surprised your wife with a romantic getaway. I paid for that too." "You're lying," Zoe whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I handed her my phone, showing her 3 years of financial records. "Your husband has been living off my money while letting you believe he was providing for you. Every romantic dinner, every gift, every luxury you thought he was giving you, it was funded by your father." Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with anger. "You offered to help. You said you wanted to support your daughter. I offered to help temporarily. You turned it into a permanent arrangement while taking all the credit." Zoe was scrolling through the bank records, her face growing paler with each entry. "The jewelry you gave me for our anniversary? The weekend at the spa?" "Richard, tell me he's lying." Richard's mask was finally slipping. The charming, successful husband was being replaced by someone I'd never seen before, someone desperate and angry. "You want to know the truth?" he snapped. "Fine. Your father has been bankrolling our entire relationship because you're not capable of supporting yourself. Every job you've had has been part-time nonsense that barely covers your coffee budget. I make decent money, but not enough to support a wife who thinks she's too good for real work." The cruelty in his voice made Zoe flinch, as if he'd slapped her. "So yes, I let him pay for things. And yes, I let you believe I was the provider, because someone had to be the adult in this relationship, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be you." "Richard," Zoe's voice was barely a whisper. "That's what? You want me to apologize for protecting your feelings? For letting you live in a fantasy where you married a successful man instead of facing the reality that you're a 28-year-old child who can't function without daddy's money?" I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. "That's enough." "No, it's not enough," Richard continued, the alcohol and anger making him reckless. "You want to cut off the money? Fine. But don't pretend this is about principle. This is about a bitter old man who can't stand that his daughter found someone better than him." "Better? You've been stealing from me for 3 years. I've been managing a situation you created. If you hadn't interfered, Zoe would have learned to be independent years ago. Instead, you kept enabling her, and I had to deal with the consequences." Zoe was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband tear apart everything she'd believed about their life together. You know what the worst part is? Richard wasn't done. She actually believed she was successful. She thought our life together meant something. She had no idea she was just another burden being passed from father to husband. That's when I saw it, the moment my daughter's heart broke completely. Not just because of the money or the lies, but because of the utter contempt in her husband's voice. The man she'd chosen over me, the man she'd held up as everything I wasn't, had just reduced her to nothing more than a financial burden. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard seemed to realize he'd gone too far, but it was too late. The mask was off, and we could all see what had been underneath it the whole time. As I looked at my daughter's devastated face, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about a young woman discovering that her entire adult life had been built on lies, and that the man she'd trusted most had been the architect of her deception. The question was, what would happen now that the truth was finally out in the open? The call came at 2 a.m, 3 weeks after that devastating confrontation in their apartment. I'd been lying awake anyway, unable to stop thinking about the broken look on Zoe's face when Richard had called her a burden. The phone's shrill ring cut through the darkness like a knife. "Dad?" Zoe's voice was barely recognizable. Hoarse, exhausted, defeated. "What's wrong? Can I come over? Please?" 20 minutes later, she was standing on my doorstep with a single suitcase and eyes that looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her wedding ring was missing. "He kicked me out," she said simply, as if those 4 words could explain the wreckage of her life. I made coffee while she sat at my kitchen table, staring at her hands. The silence stretched between us until finally she started talking. "The day after you left our apartment, everything changed. Richard stopped pretending to be the man I married. It was like a switch flipped, and suddenly I could see him clearly for the first time." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug I placed in front of her. "He started picking apart everything about me, my job, my friends, the way I dressed. He said I was spoiled and useless, that I'd never contributed anything to our marriage." My jaw tightened. "Zoe, but the worst part, he was right about some of it. I was spoiled. I did think everything came easily to us. I had no idea how much money you were spending to keep up the illusion that we were successful." "That doesn't give him the right to treat you like garbage." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "When the rent came due and you weren't paying it anymore, Richard told me I needed to figure it out. So I went to the landlord to work out a payment plan, and that's when I found out how much you'd really been paying. Not just $800, Dad, $1,200. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "What?" "The rent was $1,200 a month. You were paying $800, and Richard was supposed to cover the rest. But he never did. The landlord said they'd been accepting partial payments for months because Richard convinced them you were having financial difficulties and would catch up eventually." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. Not only had Richard been taking credit for my financial support, he'd been skimming $400 a month while letting me believe I was covering the full rent. "That's not all," Zoe continued. "I found credit card statements hidden in his office. Richard's been using our joint account to pay for things I never knew about. Gambling debts, expensive dinners with coworkers, a weekend trip to Las Vegas with his friends that he told me was a work conference." I felt sick. "How much debt?" $18,000. "And now that your money isn't coming in," she gestured helplessly. "We got an eviction notice yesterday. Richard said it was my fault for ruining everything with you, that I needed to fix it. Is that why you're here? To ask me to fix it?" She shook her head quickly. "No, yes, at first that's what I thought. But then Richard made it clear what he expected me to do." The way she said it made my blood run cold. "What did he expect?" "He wanted me to come here and manipulate you. He had this whole plan worked out. I was supposed to cry and apologize and make you feel guilty for abandoning your daughter. He said to remind you that Mom would be disappointed in you for giving up on family." The mention of Margaret hit like a physical blow. "He told you to use your mother's memory against me?" When I refused, he lost it completely. He said if I wasn't going to be useful, then I could find somewhere else to live. He packed my clothes in a suitcase and told me not to come back unless I was ready to do what needed to be done. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold and trembling. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I keep thinking about what he said that night, about me being a burden passed from father to husband. What if he's right? What if I really am just useless? Stop! My voice was sharper than I intended. You are not useless. You made some mistakes, but that doesn't define who you are. Over the next few days, I watched my daughter grapple with the reality of her situation. Richard called constantly at first, alternating between angry demands that she come home and sweet apologies for his behavior. When she didn't respond, the calls became more frequent and more desperate. He's been calling my work, she told me one evening. My boss had to ask me to handle my personal issues on my own time. Have you considered changing your number? I keep thinking he might actually apologize, that maybe we can work through this. But Richard wasn't interested in working through anything. When sweet talking didn't work, he switched tactics. Mutual friends started calling Zoe, telling her that Richard was devastated and that she was being cruel by abandoning her marriage over money problems. Sarah called today, Zoe said after a particularly difficult conversation. She said Richard told everyone that you cut us off financially without warning, and now we're homeless because of your selfishness. What did you tell her? Nothing. How do I explain that my entire marriage was built on lies? That the man I thought was taking care of me was actually stealing from my father? The social isolation was taking its toll. Friends who had admired their seemingly perfect relationship were now taking sides, and most of them believed Richard's version of events. After all, he was charming and successful, while Zoe was the one who had moved back in with her father. But the worst moment came 2 weeks after she'd moved in with me. Richard showed up at my house unannounced, dressed in his most expensive suit and carrying flowers. "I'd like to speak with my wife," he said, when I answered the door. "She doesn't want to see you." "That's not your decision to make." Zoe appeared behind me before I could respond. "It's okay, Dad. Let him in." However, what followed was the most manipulative performance I'd ever witnessed. Richard apologized for his harsh words, blamed his behavior on stress from work, and promised things would be different if she'd just come home. He painted a picture of a future where he'd learned from his mistakes, and they could rebuild their marriage stronger than before. "I've already talked to a financial counselor," he said, holding her hands and looking deep into her eyes. "We can work out a payment plan for the debts, get back on track. I just need my wife beside me to do it." For a terrifying moment, I thought she might actually believe him. The longing in her face was heartbreaking. She wanted so desperately for this nightmare to be fixable. But then, Richard made his fatal mistake. "Of course, we'll need your father's help for a few more months while we get back on our feet, just temporarily until the financial counseling starts working." The spell broke. Zoe pulled her hands away and stood up. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money, Richard. This is about respect. This is about honesty. And you've never given me either of those things." Richard's mask slipped for just a second, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Fine, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away." As I watched him leave, I felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because my daughter had finally seen through his manipulation. Sadness because I knew the hardest part was still ahead of her. Learning to live without the lies was going to be harder than learning to live without the money. Living with Zoe again after all these years was both a blessing and a challenge. She'd been with me for 6 weeks, sleeping in her old childhood bedroom, trying to piece together a life that felt authentic for the first time in years. But the process wasn't easy, and some days I wondered if either of us was strong enough to see it through. The first sign of real progress came when she got a full-time job at a local marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly data entry and basic administrative tasks, but it was honest employment with benefits and room for growth. The day she got the offer, I found her crying in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" I asked, immediately fearing the worst. "Nothing's wrong," she said, wiping her eyes. I'm proud of myself." "Is that silly? It's just an entry-level position, but I got it on my own. No help from you, no influence from Richard, just me." "It's not silly at all. Your mother would be so proud." That night, for the first time since she'd moved back home, Zoe seemed genuinely happy. She talked about her plans for the future, about maybe taking night classes to get better qualifications, about finding her own apartment once she'd saved enough for a deposit. It felt like we were finally moving forward. Then, Richard started his campaign to win her back. It began subtly. Flowers delivered to her workplace with notes about how much he missed her. Text messages, late at night, apologizing for his behavior and begging for another chance. He'd learned from his mistakes, he said. He was getting help for his gambling problem. He'd even started seeing a therapist to work on his anger issues. He seems different, Zoe said one evening, showing me his latest message, more sincere. I looked at the carefully crafted words on her phone screen and felt a familiar anger rising in my chest. Zoe, people don't change that quickly. But what if he has? What if losing me really was the wake-up call he needed? And what if it wasn't? Are you willing to risk everything you've built here on the chance that Richard has suddenly become the man you wanted him to be? She didn't answer, but I could see the doubt creeping back into her eyes. The seed Richard was planting was taking root. The real test came when he showed up at her workplace. Zoe's supervisor called me because Richard was in the lobby, claiming to be her husband and demanding to see her. When she refused to come down, he caused enough of a scene that security had to escort him out. That evening, Zoe was quiet during dinner. Finally, she spoke. He looked terrible, Dad. Like he hasn't been sleeping or eating. Maybe he really is suffering without me. Of course he's suffering. His meal ticket is gone. That's cruel. Is it, Zoe? What do you think is going to happen if you go back to him? Do you think he's suddenly going to start paying his own bills? Do you think he's going to respect you more because you have a job that pays $32,000 a year? She flinched at the harsh reality of her situation. Even with her new job, she was barely making enough to cover basic expenses. The comfortable lifestyle she'd enjoyed with Richard, the nice apartment, the dinners out, the shopping trips, all of that had been funded by my money. I'm not saying I want to go back to him, she said defensively. I'm just saying maybe I should hear him out. Why? Because she struggled to find the words. Because I'm scared, okay? I'm scared that I'm never going to find someone else who wants to be with me. Richard might have been lying about the money, but he did choose me. He married me. What if nobody else ever does? The vulnerability in her voice broke my heart. This was what Richard's emotional abuse had done to her, made her believe she was lucky to have anyone at all, even someone who treated her terribly. Sweetheart, you're 28 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't settle for someone who makes you feel small just because you're afraid of being alone. But fear is a powerful motivator, and Richard knew exactly how to exploit it. He started showing up at places where he knew she'd be. The grocery store near our house, the coffee shop where she liked to go on weekend mornings. Each encounter was carefully orchestrated to seem accidental, and each time he looked a little more pathetic, a little more repentant. The breaking point came when he enlisted help from an unexpected source, my own sister, Linda. Linda called me on a Saturday morning, her voice tight with disapproval. David, I think you're being too hard on that boy. What boy? Richard. He came to see me yesterday, and he's absolutely heartbroken. He knows he made mistakes, but he loves Zoe. He's willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. What exactly did he tell you? He explained about the financial problems, how you suddenly cut off support without warning. He said Zoe moved out because she was embarrassed about needing help, but that he's ready to take full responsibility for their expenses now. And you believed him? Why wouldn't I? He seemed very sincere. He even showed me documentation from a financial counselor and a therapist. The boy is clearly getting his life together. I closed my eyes, recognizing Richard's manipulation for what it was. He'd presented Linda with a carefully edited version of events, one that painted him as the reformed husband trying to win back his stubborn wife. Linda, did he mention the 3 years of lying, the gambling debts, the way he spoke to Zoe the night she left? Everyone has problems, David. The question is whether they're willing to work on them. Richard is. Are you going to stand in the way of your daughter's happiness because you're still angry? That evening, Linda called Zoe directly. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand that my sister was delivering a carefully crafted message about forgiveness, second chances, and the importance of fighting for love. When Zoe hung up, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. Aunt Linda thinks I should give him another chance. She says he's really changed, that he's getting professional help. She thinks you're letting your pride get in the way of our reconciliation. And what do you think? I don't know what to think anymore. Everyone else seems to believe he's changed. Maybe I'm the one who's being stubborn. I realized then that Richard had played this perfectly. By involving Linda, he'd created doubt about my motives and made Zoe question her own judgment. He was using my own family against me, just as he'd used my money against me for years. Zoe, I want you to do something for me. I want you to write down everything Richard did to you, not just the financial stuff, but everything. The way he spoke to you, the way he made you feel, the promises he broke. Write it all down and then decide if those are things you're willing to risk experiencing again. She agreed, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Richard's campaign was working. He was slowly convincing her that their problems had been circumstantial, that with the right support and professional help, they could build something real together. What she didn't know was that Richard was already planning his next move, and this time, he was going to make sure I couldn't interfere. The call came 2 days later. Richard had hired a lawyer and was threatening to sue me for alienation of affection, claiming that I had deliberately sabotaged his marriage by withdrawing financial support and turning his wife against him. It was a ridiculous claim that would never hold up in court, but that wasn't the point. The point was to create enough pressure that I'd either back down or look like the vindictive father-in-law trying to destroy his daughter's happiness. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Richard had been planning this all along. The therapy, the financial counseling, the carefully timed encounters with Zoe, it was all building toward this moment when he could present himself as the victim of my unreasonable interference. The question was whether Zoe would see through his final manipulation, or if she'd let fear and family pressure drive her back into the arms of a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, exactly 3 months after that devastating Father's Day dinner. Zoe had been living with me for 10 weeks, and I'd watched her slowly rebuild her confidence and sense of self. But Richard's pressure campaign was taking its toll. The constant messages, the involvement of well-meaning family members, and now the threat of legal action were wearing her down. She'd been quiet all day, barely speaking during dinner. Finally, as we sat in the living room watching the rain streak down the windows, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said, about writing everything down." I looked up from my book. "And?" "I did it. I wrote it all down. Every lie, every manipulation, every time he made me feel like I wasn't good enough." She pulled out a notebook from beneath the couch cushion. "Do you want to know what I realized?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "He never loved me, not the real me. He loved the idea of me, a woman who would be grateful for whatever scraps of affection he threw my way, who wouldn't ask too many questions about money, who would make him look good to his friends. But the actual person I am, he spent 3 years trying to change that." She opened the notebook and began reading. October 15th, 2 years ago. Richard told me my laugh was too loud and embarrassing when we were out with his co-workers. November 3rd, same year. He said my job at the art gallery was a hobby, not real work, and that I should focus on being a better wife instead. December 20th. He threw away a painting I'd been working on because he said it was cluttering up the apartment. With each entry, I felt my anger growing. Not just at Richard, but at myself for not seeing how systematically he'd been tearing down my daughter's spirit. There are 47 entries in here, Dad. 47 times I wrote down something he did that made me feel small or worthless, and those are just the ones I remembered. She closed the notebook and looked at me with tears in her eyes. I almost went back to him. I was so scared of being alone, so convinced that I was lucky to have anyone at all, that I almost walked back into that trap. "What changed your mind?" "Something you said weeks ago. You told me not to settle for someone who makes me feel small just because I'm afraid of being alone. And then I realized I'm not alone. I have you. I have this house. I have a job that I earned myself. I have friends who actually care about me, not about what I can do for them." She stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain. Richard called again today. He said his lawyer thinks he has a strong case against you, that we could probably get a settlement that would pay for our apartment and then some. My heart sank. What did you tell him? She turned back to me with a smile that reminded me of the little girl who used to bring me drawings from school. I told him to go to hell. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. Zoe, I'm done, Dad. I'm done being manipulated. I'm done feeling guilty for wanting to be treated with respect. And I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me. She sat back down beside me. I called Richard back an hour later and told him I want a divorce. I also told him that if he continues to harass you or threatens you with legal action, I'll testify about everything. The financial manipulation, the emotional abuse, all of it. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. He called me every name in the book and then hung up on me. But you know what? For the first time, his anger didn't scare me. It just made me sad for the person I used to be, the one who would have apologized for making him mad. Over the next few months, I watched my daughter transform into someone I barely recognized, and yet someone who was more herself than she'd ever been during her marriage. The divorce proceedings were ugly, with Richard fighting every step of the way, but Zoe stood firm. She refused his attempts at reconciliation, ignored his threats, and slowly built a life that was entirely her own. She moved into a small apartment across town in January, a modest place that she could afford on her salary. It wasn't fancy, one bedroom, basic appliances, no luxury amenities, but it was hers. The night she got the keys, she called me with tears in her voice. I did it, Dad. I have my own place. I'm paying my own rent. Nobody can take this away from me. Yamor, the woman who moved into that apartment was different from the one who had humiliated me at that Father's Day dinner. She was stronger, more confident, more aware of her own worth. She'd learned to cook, to manage a budget, to fix small problems without calling someone else for help. Most importantly, she'd learned to enjoy her own company. Our relationship changed, too. Instead of the strained, obligation-driven interactions we'd had during her marriage, we began to genuinely enjoy each other's company. She'd come over for dinner once a week, and we'd talk about her work, her plans for the future, books we'd both read. She asked about my life, too. Really asked, not just going through the motions. I'm sorry, she said one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset, for all of it. For the things I said, for the way I treated you, for believing Richard's lies about who you were. You don't need to apologize. You were manipulated by someone you trusted. That's not an excuse. I should have known better. I should have seen what he was doing. Maybe, but you were young and you were in love. People do foolish things when they're in love. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think I'll ever be able to trust someone again? Romantically, I mean. I think you'll be able to trust yourself again. And once you can do that, trusting the right person won't be so scary. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Zoe started dating again. Nothing serious at first, just coffee dates and casual dinners with men she met through work or friends. But I could see her confidence growing with each interaction. She was learning to set boundaries, to recognize red flags, to value herself enough to walk away from anyone who didn't treat her well. The real test came when she introduced me to Michael, a teacher she'd been seeing for 2 months. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. During dinner at my house, I watched how he interacted with Zoe, with respect, genuine interest, and without any need to dominate the conversation or prove his superiority. After he left, Zoe helped me clean up the dishes. So what do you think? I think he seems like a good man. More importantly, what do you think? I think I'm finally ready to trust my own judgment again. A year later, I sat in the front row of a small church watching my daughter marry Michael in a simple ceremony that she'd planned and paid for herself. There were no expensive flowers, no elaborate reception, no pretentious displays of wealth. Just 2 people who genuinely loved and respected each other, surrounded by family and friends who cared about their happiness. As Zoe walked down the aisle, radiant in a dress she'd chosen because she loved it, not because it impressed anyone else, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was who she was meant to be, not a trophy wife or a financial burden, but a strong, independent woman who knew her own worth. During his toast at the reception, Michael mentioned how much he admired Zoe's resilience and independence. "She's taught me," he said, "that real love isn't about what you can provide for someone, but about who you become when you're with them. Zoe makes me want to be a better man, not because she demands it, but because she deserves it." Later that evening, as the guests were leaving, Zoe found me sitting alone at our table. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For loving me enough to let me fall. For not rescuing me when I needed to learn to rescue myself. For showing me that I'm worth more than I ever knew." I hugged my daughter tight, remembering the scared young woman who had come to my door with a single suitcase and a broken heart. The person she'd become, strong, confident, genuinely happy, was someone Richard had never allowed her to be. As I drove home that night, I thought about that terrible Father's Day dinner that had started it all. At the time, it had felt like the end of our relationship, but it had actually been the beginning of something better, a real family bond based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone isn't your money or your protection. Sometimes it's the chance to discover their own strength. Zoe had found hers, and watching her use it to build a life she truly wanted was worth every difficult moment we'd endured to get there. The old man who wasn't half the man her husband was had raised a daughter who was twice the woman anyone had ever expected her to be, and that, I realized, was a legacy worth celebrating.